off your engine! Well, here's an interesting story. It turns out that the new Toyota Rav4 Prime failed the moose test. There's a Swedish publication, and they have this real tricky course, and a vehicle has to make it at 44.7 miles per hour average speed without hitting all the obstacles to pass the test. Now, you might wonder why it's 44.7 miles an hour. Well, that's 72 kilometers an hour. So, give you an idea. They're all into that kilometer stuff in Europe, and it is a Swedish publication. Now, the Rav4 Prime failed it. Interestingly enough, the previous year, the Rav4 failed it, but Toyota reprogrammed all of their vehicle control stuff so they could pass, and then that passed. But the new Rav4 Prime failed. You got to understand that the Rav4 Prime, of course, it can go further on electricity. The Prime means you can run on electricity only for so many miles and plug it in. Some of them go up almost 30 miles on electricity alone. But they do that with a much heavier battery. And that extra weight sprung wherever it sits makes it not be able to handle this course without crashing. Of course, it's in Sweden, so they call it the moose test, because they want you to be able to bypass a moose. Because I imagine if you hit a moose with your vehicle, moose are rather large, and I've seen people here in Tennessee hit deer, and it kind of destroyed the car. Well, a moose is a lot bigger than a Tennessee deer, and it would probably demolish your car if you hit a moose. So you wouldn't want to hit a moose in your car. Now, the Mitsubishi Outlander part electric vehicle and the Volvo XC40 Recharge, they also failed this test. You put heavier batteries in, you get a bigger hybrid car, it's not going to handle as well. That's just how it goes. The more weight you put in a vehicle, and those aren't particularly low vehicles, these are all SUV-ish type things, and so they're higher up in the ground, and they are not going to handle as well. That's only common sense. The lower you go, the better a vehicle handles. I mean, look at race cars. They're real low to the ground because they handle 200 miles an hour in corners. SUVs, the higher you go, the worse they're going to handle. If you're worried about hitting elk and stuff, you don't want a big old SUV. You want something that's lower to the ground that not only will handle better, but, they could easily bounce off better because it's lower and they could swing off. I've seen people hit deer here, and if they hit them with a tall vehicle, it wiped out a lot of the tall vehicle. But I've seen them hit them with smaller, more wedge-shaped vehicles, and they actually bounced over the vehicle and didn't do all that much damage. I imagine Toyota, with their Rav4 Prime, will figure the software to make that pass next year, because last year, 2019, their regular Rav4 failed the test, but now it passed. They changed the software, so I'm assuming they probably will, because it'd be a feather in their cap to pass this moose test with an SUV. But just it's something to think about if you are buying SUVs. They do not handle as well. They will topple over easier. They're higher up in the air. The higher the center of gravity, the easier the vehicles are either going to tip over or lose control because they're less stable. That's just something you got to realize if you're buying a higher up vehicle. It is not going to be as stable as a lower down vehicle. Because if it was, race cars would be high up in the air, and they aren't. They're real close to the ground. Well, you might wonder about some cheap eBay parts. Well, a guy by the name of Richard Holdener, he decided to test off a cheap $163 eBay knockoff turbo. And he put it on a bunch of engines. Now, is an eBay knockoff of a Garrett GT45 turbo. He tried it on 8 different engines, and what did he find? Surprisingly enough, he found that it worked quite well, that he really bumped up the horsepower on these engines. He put it on a 2.4-liter Honda, all the way up to a 7.4-liter 454 American V8. And he took a 300-horsepower K24, added 14.7 pounds of boost, and in his video, he got 585 horsepower, which, the max you're going to get is 600, so it worked quite well. So you can see these things can work. Now, realize this is done on E85 gasoline, race pump gas, because you're only going to get a ton of horsepower with the ethanol. You won't get as much with regular gas you buy at the pump. But, and this is a big but as far as I'm concerned, okay, the guy tested it out. He tested them out, and they worked on his dyno on the engines he put it on. Let's see how long they last. That's the kicker. Now, interesting that he got the horsepower. It worked for that. I agree. But from my experience, the cheap turbos, they'll wear out. You got these turbines that are spinning at 100,000 RPM or more, spinning like mad. The bearings are going to wear out. I've seen people put these cheap turbos on and they run, but not for all that long. One, when they're designed even in a normal production car, they'll wear out over time. You're not going to last 300,000-400,000 miles, and they're set up so that they are either oil cooled or oil and radiator coolant cooled to try to keep the heat down. And you just bolt something on. Yeah, it can work on a dyno, puts out a lot of horsepower, but how long it lasts, that's another story. If there's anybody out there that's tested these things over time, I'd love to see it. Please send me some videos, send me some information, because I'd love to see how they work over time, because these did work. I'm not arguing that. He showed how they work. But for how long are they going to work? You put it on and it blows up. Now, on the other hand, one has to consider that a real Garrett turbo is going to cost over $2,000, and this eBay special was $163. Now, this guy bought him from a company called DNA Motoring on eBay. Might check him out. Another one of the stores is called CX Racing that sells on eBay. Hey, if you want to mess around with a turbo to get some speed, just to see what you can get out, and you're not planning on driving it for, 100,000 miles, maybe it could be a fun toy. I would just kind of doubt that these things are going to last a really long time. There's got to be a difference between a $2,000 one and a $163 one over the metallurgy. The bearing's going to last, the rotor's going to last. That's just common sense. But they did put out power when they were first bolted on. I'll give them that. Austin David said, Scotty, I got an 87 Honda Accord, 130,000 miles automatic. I bought it for $450. The guy couldn't get it to stay running. I put spark plugs in. But when you put it in D4, the car shakes a lot and slips back and forth from drive to neutral. The only way you can drive is by shifting it manually. Help. All right, well, I know the Hondas, and often when they're that old, the transmissions go out. And generally, if you have a car and drive and you take off and it pops into neutral, it's almost always internal transmission failure. And in that vehicle, if I were you, I'd just shift it by hand and drive it as long as you could. You only paid $450. To do over an automatic transmission, an 87 Accord is going to cost you at least $3,000, if not more. They're very complex. Hardly anybody knows how to rebuild them. But you might get lucky. It might be popping out because a motor mount or a transmission mount is broken, or in the case of an old 87, it might not even be there. It might have come off and nobody ever fixed it. And if the mounts are bad, it's going to pop out because you take off, it pops off because the motor and transmission are shaking. So check them first and pray it's got a broken motor mount. It's old enough. It's what? 34 years old, so it could be the motor mounts or the transmission mounts are broken. Pray it's that. That would be an easy fix. Skysank says, long story short, the decision comes down to one of these two vehicles I'm going to buy. I'm buying it new. And it absolutely has to be an automatic, so either a Kia CVT IVT versus Subaru CVT. Thoughts? All right. With that, I would go Subaru. I actually would buy Toyota or Honda myself, but if that's what it comes down to, Kia and Hyundai are basically the same company. They've had problems. They've had problems with the transmissions. They've had problems with all kinds of things over time. Subaru, now, they have very good engineers, and they are designing all their own stuff. They're designing their transmission. They're not buying them from Nissan anymore. They're not Jatco transmissions. I personally wouldn't buy one. I'd get a Toyota or Honda, pay a little bit more, get a lot better quality. But out of those, I would definitely go Subaru. Especially if you live where it snows a lot, because their all-wheel drive system is killer. And every vehicle they make is all-wheel drive except for their little sports car. They've been making all-wheel drive cars for a long time, and they are very dependable. The all-wheel drive systems never really have any problems. So all around of those, yeah, go ahead and get a Subaru over a Kia. You'd be happier in the long run, from my experience of my customers with Subarus and versus Kias and Hyundai's, which basically the same company anyway. Jay says, would an '03 Chevy Impala with 87,000 miles be a good first car? It's an automatic with a 3.4 V6 engine. It costs $1,500. Is it a good deal? No. I'd custom those Impalas. They had horrible engines, transmissions, rolling piles of junk. And at that age, it's 18 years old. Odds are the transmission or the engine or both will go out soon. It's unfortunate because back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, the Impalas were excellent cars. My father had one. We got 190,000 miles, and we had to get rid of it because the body rusted off. But he sold it to the junkyard man who took the engine out and put it in his junkyard tow truck for pickup picking up junk cars with. And it ran for years and years and years. So, I mean, they were solid built, other than they rusted out because they didn't rust-proof them right. But today, no. An 03 Impala is a junky car. It's horrible. You'd be better buying a really old Toyota Camry that maybe had 200,000 miles on for that kind of money. It would probably last tons longer than an Impala. It's a shame, but they don't make them good anymore. They don't make them anymore. They finally stopped making them. I believe this year was the last year they made Impalas. They've just given up on the whole line of cars because people realized they're junk and they couldn't sell them anymore. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.